My joy was that he would be able to go home because he hadn't been home in a year. I was also very happy to see that he would have caring parents and, in fact, a church community that would surround him and surround his parents because they would really need support. It is not always the case. I have witnessed families, especially at Walter Reed, who show up and not only are they ill-prepared to try to reach out and take care of their Marine, but some of them are unwilling.
A Marine chaplain takes us inside the Wounded Warriors Project to witness the power and resilience of a family's loyalty, the inspiration of wounded young men and women fighting to retain their wholeness, and the challenges that can quickly turn to tragedy. Hello, welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation here in Richmond, Virginia. The service record of Laura Bender, a naval and Marine chaplain, breaks new ground at almost every stop in her long military career. In today's story, Laura gives us an intimate look at the consequences of a grievous wound or illness suffered in service to America, from the viewpoint not only of the warrior, but how suddenly and completely the lives of families and caregivers can be turned upside down. Now, Melissa Price will perform To Serve and Protect. Afterward, Laura and I will speak about the unquenchable spirit of the Marine Corps and of love.
Adelsberger Hall sat atop a steep hill in the wooded area above Butler Stadium on Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia. Named for Lance Corporal Christopher S. Adelsberger, who, while fighting in Fallujah, Iraq, had single-handedly raced up a stairway under fire and cleared a rooftop in order to shield wounded Marines from further harm. The building housed the Marine Corps Wounded Warrior Regiment. Unlike the Navy's Safe Harbor program, which offered as-needed assistance and resources to wounded, ill, or injured sailors, the Wounded Warrior Regiment was an actual military unit. Marines assigned to the unit were those whose medical issues required extensive hospitalization or intervention and precluded their ability to fill an operational billet. Staff members included active duty and reserve Marines, and sailors, veterans, military spouses, and civilians. The regiment existed not only to keep a tight hold on those in the recovery process, but to advocate for their needs as fiercely as the Marines executed combat. As the regimental chaplain, I was responsible for 2 Wounded Warrior Battalion chaplains, one at Camp Lejeune and the other at Camp Pendleton, as well as the chaplain assigned to the Marine Corps detachment in Landstuhl, Germany. I would have traded my supervisory assignment with any of those chaplains in a heartbeat, because they provided consistent, direct care to Marines. My opportunities to work with wounded, ill, and injured Marines were anything but consistent. I spent Wednesdays at Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland, visiting patients and meeting with the families of newly arrived wounded Marines. Tensions were always high in those gatherings, as exhausted parents and/or spouses who had raced across the country after receiving the news tried to wrap their minds around their Marines' injuries. Most of the time, these were severe enough to be not only life-altering for the Marines, but also for their families. I divided the rest of my time between meetings, ceremonies, warrior athlete reconditioning program events, and visits to Marine Corps detachments around the country to intervene in the crisis du jour. Since the Navy had paid for me to get a master's in conflict transformation, they expected me to use it. In Little Rock, Arkansas, I mediated between a wife and a mother, with opposing views about the future of their Marine who had been in a coma for a year. Although the Marine died 3 weeks later, the mother and finally accepted daughter-in-law were then able to support each other in their grief. In San Antonio, Texas, the overly anxious family of a severely burned pilot needed a calming influence and some focused attention during his lengthy stay in the burn ward. In a hospital in Richmond, Virginia, parents who had taken up residence in a waiting room needed to be convinced to go home. Sitting behind a table piled high with loose tobacco as they rolled their cigarettes, the dad explained, "If our Marine is going to be here in a few months, we going to stay too. Besides, there's air conditioning here. We ain't got none at home." Their Marine had had a quadrant of his skull removed and stored in a freezer to take the pressure off his swollen brain. His second biggest concern was having to return to live with his parents if he recovered. The Wounded Warrior Regiment's concern was to find the best possible outcome for all their Marines. Most families were ill-situated to care for a gravely injured son, daughter, or spouse without major sacrifices. Someone would have to give up their job to become a full-time caregiver. Houses would need to be renovated to accommodate medical needs and equipment, and serious monitoring would need to be done for families where addictions, mental health issues, and illegal behaviors ruled the day. The issues facing wounded, ill, and injured Marines were complicated, not only during their recovery phase, but long into the future. In the conference room of Adelsberger Hall, our team met daily at 0800 to fight the barriers to health and wholeness in whatever form they presented themselves. "COs inbound," the staff sergeant bellowed. I raced in the side door of the conference room to stand behind my assigned seat at the table. "Tension on deck," he called. Even the civilians stood tall. The colonel and command sergeant major entered. "Seats, everyone," the CO said. "Good morning, gentlemen and ladies. I trust everyone had a good weekend. Slides, please." Around the large wooden table, staff members held pens at the ready. The staff sergeant hit the button. The first PowerPoint slides covered the current high-visibility cases. An IED took out a vehicle in Afghanistan, 1 dead, 3 injured. 2 of those are heading to Landstuhl. Across the table, the civilian non-medical case manager noted the name of the deceased. "We'll get with the casual affairs coordinator to see if they need anything from us," she said. The staff sergeant hit the button again. A Marine out of Pendleton went missing over the weekend. Police found him next to his vehicle in the desert. He'd eaten his gun. The staff sergeant grunted as he jotted details. He nodded toward the mental health coordinator. They'd worked on these issues too many times together. The slide changed to reveal the name and contact info for a Marine spouse. Our winner for the day. Somehow, she got a hold of the commandant's wife's phone number and called her Saturday night with a list of complaints. The CO shook his head. "How do these spouses get her contact info?" The command advisor, a civilian, answered, "She gives it out at events and tells people to call her with problems. Who's going to tell her no?" I was glad he'd said that. I didn't want to rat her out. Besides, if Mrs. Commandant could light a fire that resulted in a problem solved for a WII Marine, good on her. The next few slides covered scheduling. Events included a Hire Heroes job fair, a marriage enrichment retreat in Alaska, a cutting horse rodeo on the East Coast, and an elk hunt on the West Coast. Several visits by senior military, politicians, CEOs, and anyone else who wanted their picture taken with a wounded warrior made the list too. Of course, some genuinely wanted to offer assistance. Others knew the publicity value of a photo with a Marine with traumatic amputations. I saw both kinds of visitors at Walter Reed. David McCallum and Leon Panetta made my good guy list, but too many others were at best trauma tourists, and often just there to exploit the Marines for social credit. Chaplain, the WWBN West slide lists the date for the San Diego USO Gala. The CO said, "I got a call Friday from their president. He liked the prayers you wrote for the warrior trials, and he wants you to give the invocation for the gala." "Sir, we have a chaplain with Wounded Warrior Battalion West. Shouldn't I call him? He's only an hour away." "Chaplain, the USO donates $100,000 a year for WWR events and 3 weeks of 24/7 volunteer coverage for the warrior trials. If they want you to pray for them, you'll pray for them. You can check up on the 29 Palms detachment while you're out there too." "Yes, sir." I jotted down the date and a note to take my mess dress uniform to the cleaners. Next, it was time for the team to report on current issues. The family readiness officer spoke about her weekly conference call with spouses. The future initiatives and public affairs team described their current strategic lobbying and media activity. The Sergeant Merlin German call center, which resourced wounded, ill, and injured active duty, reserve, and veteran Marines and their family members across the country, reported the number of calls received over the weekend and a statistical breakdown of the presenting issues. The Warrior Athlete Reconditioning Program announced the date for the seated volleyball tournament at the Pentagon Gym. My second favorite sport, I added it to my calendar. Oddly, it was the one athletic activity where still having one's legs proved detrimental. But nothing could beat the thrill of Marines playing wheelchair basketball with the added mix of wrestling, bumper cars, and ballet. A few more sit-reps were shared before Staff Sergeant PowerPoint announced, "Let's end with some good news." He advanced the slide. Lance Corporal Smith is finally heading home. The CO said, "For those of you who don't remember this high-vis case from a year ago, he and a fellow Marine were returning to Parris Island after a night out in Savannah, Georgia. The other Marine, the driver, didn't notice the traffic circle ahead. He entered without braking, and the curb launched the vehicle into the air. It crashed at full speed into a tree. The passenger side, Smith's side, took the brunt of it. Lance Corporal Smith has been hospitalized for a year. Have any of you met him?" I raised my hand. "Sir, I visited with him twice at the Richmond VA and briefly met his mom at the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth after his recent transfer." I couldn't imagine how they'd send him home. The last time I saw him, he sat drooling in his wheelchair. His only means of communicating were the slight movement of one arm, a few grunts, and some eye blinking. Caring for Smith at home would be a full-time job. The CO continued. "Lance Corporal Smith is now at the VA in New Haven, Connecticut. At 1100 today, he will arrive at his family home. His recovery care coordinator says a welcome home gathering of friends and family will be there to greet him. This is a great day. One of our men is going home." At the end of the meeting, I headed for my office to address items on my STD list. Since many of the tasks on this stuff-to-do list were recurring, annoying, and usually socially transmitted, it seemed an apt name. Just after lunch, my assistant darkened my doorway. "Chaps, they're getting the band back together. Conference room, 15 minutes, ma'am." Knowing this couldn't be good, I grabbed my cup to retrieve more coffee. "Come with me, we'll probably need it." He followed me to the coffee mess. I yawned. I downed a few gulps of coffee and poured more. Let's get to the conference room to hear about the latest disaster. The CO arrived a few minutes later. "Seats, everyone. Here are the details." Lance Corporal Smith's recovery care coordinator stopped by Smith's home at 0930 to make sure everything was in order. No one was home, but the door was unlocked. He let himself in. What he found was an inappropriate environment for someone in Smith's condition. Most rooms were under construction. There was no running water, and the bathroom attached to Smith's room had no toilet. He sent me photos. We examined them on the screen. When Smith's father got home, our RCC told him his son would not be coming home that day or ever unless the housing situation changed. A heated argument ensued and got worse when the dad found out the RCC had entered his home and taken pictures without his knowledge or presence. In front of the family and friends gathering at the curb, they screamed at each other. The dad grabbed a baseball bat and chased our RCC off his property. Just then, the ambulance pulled up with the lance corporal inside. Our RCC spoke to the driver, and it pulled away. The lead RCC asked, "Sir, did our guy call the police about the attempted assault?" "No. Thank goodness he was smart enough not to do that, or he could have been arrested for unlawful entry. He entered an empty house without permission." "But the dad went after him with a bat." "Yes, but the dad could argue he was chasing an intruder. The Marine Corps doesn't want this mess in the news or for our RCC to be arrested." "Thoughts?" The mental health coordinator asked, "Has the dad made contact with anyone since this happened?" "Yes, he called the VA rep and demanded they bring his son home. But they can't release the young man until the RCC signs off on the suitability of the residence. And we can't send a different RCC because the dad has said that if anyone in a Marine uniform comes near his house again, he'll beat them with his bat." I stared at the photos on the screen. Yes, they showed ongoing construction, so what? It wasn't as if the young man could wander around the house and possibly hurt himself. And the water? Perhaps it had been turned off to install the toilet. Besides, Smith had a catheter and wore a diaper. I asked, "Sir, he specifically said anyone wearing a Marine uniform?" "Yes, Chaplain." "I have a Navy uniform." The room grew silent. Perhaps they were contemplating who would deliver my eulogy. The CO spoke. "Make the arrangement, chaps. You fly tomorrow morning." As soon as I landed in Hartford, Connecticut, I rented a car and drove to the McDonald's near the Smiths' home. Downed a cup of coffee, then changed into my navy dress blue uniform. Looking in the mirror, I smiled and made a sign of the cross. As a Methodist, it's not part of my tradition, but it seemed like a good idea under the circumstances. Before stopping at the Smiths' house, I drove around the neighborhood. The modest homes showed age and a few were run down, but for the most part, the area seemed to house blue-collar working families. I stopped in front of the Smiths' home. The grass had recently been mowed. To the left of the driveway sat a rented dumpster, a sign of ongoing renovation. A raised ranch, the house was larger than most others on the street. I paused to collect myself. "Okay, God, it's just you and me. Please let me keep my head and my cool." I walked to the front door and knocked. I heard muffled voices, then the door opened part way. A tall black man in work clothes looked out. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Smith, I'm Chaplain Laura Bender. I'm here about your son." He stared at me intently. I moved my hand to my purse strap so the cross on my sleeve would be visible. "You're a chaplain?" He paused and turned his head. Someone behind him spoke, but I couldn't hear the words. He turned back toward me. "Would you like to come in?" "Yes, Mr. Smith, I'd love to." As I entered, I noticed his wife standing on the stairs. Why don't you bring her up here to the kitchen, and I'll make us some coffee?" "I'd love some coffee, thank you. I don't know if you remember me, but I met you in Portsmouth a few weeks ago when your son was there for an evaluation." "I thought you looked familiar." "I heard about the unfortunate incident that occurred yesterday, and I'm here to see if we can get things back on track. I'm sure you're eager to get your son home." Mr. Smith and I sat at the table in the middle of the clean and neat kitchen. A small chandelier hung over the stairs I had just climbed. "What a beautiful fixture," I said, pointing. "I love the brass flowers interspersed among the lights." "I bought it at the Habitat for Humanity store when I was looking for bathroom cabinets. Do you know about that store?" "Know it? My husband practically lives there. He brought home a light for over our stairs, too. It's matte brass and looks like shafts of wheat. Mrs. Smith put 3 cups of coffee on the table and sat. We chatted all about our good habitat finds as we drank. So, are you doing a lot of renovations? Yeah, see, when our son was in that accident, we were living in an apartment in Bridgeport. There was no way we could bring him home there. No room, and we didn't own the place, so we couldn't make any modifications. When he got his check, we used it to buy this house. I know it was his money, but we needed a proper home for him. The house was cheap because it needed a lot of work, but I figured over time I could get it done. I gutted the kitchen and redid it first. You got to be able to cook. I nodded. You did a real nice job. Cabinets from Habitat? Mostly everything I've installed is. Some men from church helped me too, but that Marine who came here yesterday let himself in through the garage. All he saw were the rooms I haven't finished yet. I let Mr. Smith vent for a few more minutes without interrupting. For the most part, I agreed with him. Although the RCC was required to check the house for suitability before authorizing their son to go home, he shouldn't have entered without permission. I also wondered how much race and class had been factors in the white RCC's decision. If a white father in a middle-class suburb was renovating some rooms, would he have acted the same? Would you like to see what I'm working on? He asked. He took me on a tour of the house. We started in his son's bedroom. A hospital bed sat in the middle of the room, aligned with the window, so his son could see life outside. See this vertical beam that starts over his bed and extends into the bathroom? He reached above his head and slid a device along the beam. A harness attaches here and will help me lift my son. Then I can slide him over to the bathtub. That's genius. He beamed. I figured I'd need assistance with his weight. I'm not getting any younger. I pointed to the now-in-place toilet. Wax seal give you any trouble? No. I hadn't planned to do that until today, but since some guys from the church were here for the homecoming that didn't happen, they gave me a hand. We did the toilet first. Dishes were piling up in the kitchen sink, and their wives and mine were giving me the look. Proud of his handiwork and happy to show it off, Mr. Smith took me from room to room to see what he'd already done and explain his plans. 2 hours after I had approached the Smiths' front door with fear and trembling, I departed with hugs. My next stop was the VA hospital to see our Lance Corporal. On the way, I called the regimental head of the recovery care coordinators to report on my visit. By the time I reached the VA, the decision had been made. Lance Corporal Smith squeezed my hand when I told him the news, and a tear ran down his cheek. He was ready. The next morning, as I flew back to D.C., Lance Corporal Smith arrived at his new home, where his father was now his full-time caregiver, so his mother could continue her work as a hairdresser. Around the country, other parents and spouses began their day by bathing and feeding their wounded, ill, or injured warriors. Young men and women who had served their country well sat on the edge of their bed to attach prosthetic limbs. Too many Marines woke alone in empty homes because their unaddressed PTSD or TBIs had chased away their families. Others wondered if today was the day to end their torment. I headed back to the Wounded Warrior Regiment to join my colleagues in the continued fight to shield WII Marines from further harm, praying that our efforts would honor their level of commitment and their sacrifice.
That was To Serve and Protect, read by Melissa Price, written by Laura Bender, who joins me from her rural home in Michigan. And today, Laura has put a cover on her parakeets, so we have privacy. To Serve and Protect. That is on the one hand, a really somber story, and I think beautifully read by Melissa. But if we accept that this kind of physical human damage and carnage is inevitable with war, which is the largest argument, by the way, against war, is this. On the other hand, it's also kind of a hopeful story because there are families like the Smiths. But I want to start at the end of your piece and work my way backwards because you ended in your concluding passages by saying that families worry about the Marines when they're downrange, and then they get this word that their Marine has been traumatically wounded or ill, and their lives are upended. And sometimes the families don't answer the call like the Smiths, and sometimes the Marines don't have the will to continue like Lance Corporal Smith did. And you said that sometimes even they contemplate, is this the day they end their pain? Knowing all of that, can you describe how moved you were by the commitment of the Smith family, this good family, that was clearly misjudged for reasons that were unsaid, but you took good guesses at them? What did it mean to you to see this Marine going home to a family that was going to be this committed to him, this caring?
Well, I think first, my joy was that he would be able to go home because he hadn't been home in a year. I was also very happy to see that he would have caring parents who would take care of him, and in fact, a church community that would surround him and surround his parents because they would really need support. It is not always the case. I have witnessed families, especially at Walter Reed, who show up and not only are they ill prepared to try to reach out and take care of their Marine, but some of them are unwilling. And then there were others that I was hoping would be unwilling because they just would not have done a good job on behalf of the Marine. And, the reality is that people in all life situations join the military. And then when they are wounded, ill, or injured, they have to return home to situations that maybe they tried to flee. That's why they joined the military. And then others have very supportive extended families, and they're willing to, spell each other in the caretaking. So it kind of is, across the board.
You said in the story that sometimes these soldiers come home to family settings where they're not only ill prepared, but the family settings are themselves even toxic.
Yeah.
Not settings that would be appropriate or even capable of caring for this grievous sort of set of wounds or circumstances. What happens in those cases? Now, we saw a good illustration of a best case scenario for an awful traumatic wounding of Corporal Smith. That's a best case scenario. Good family, clever, industrious father, and caring community. What happens when it's not there?
And sometimes it is not. And that often means that the Marine will remain in a VA hospital for a very long time, may mean some level of institutionalization for that Marine. These are, heartbreaking results. But then on the other hand, you also have to think that families have to make incredible sacrifices. Someone generally will lose their job. There may be a stipend, a caregiver stipend to help replace some of that, but often people, are not just working for money. Their career, it's their passion, their livelihood, and somebody has to give that up in order to stay home and take care of their Marine if their needs are so grave. And then other times, it's an adjustment to try to figure out some actual very practical things. Is the house set up well enough to manage someone in a wheelchair or someone who's quadriplegic? Is that person now employable, or do they have a traumatic brain injury that causes them to either have outbursts or not remember things? These are all complications that people don't think of, when they talk about wounds of war.
Okay, now that's among the worst case scenarios. Let's talk about the irrepressible nature of joy in the human often confounds us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have these traumatic amputations, and your favorite thing is wheelchair basketball, which you described as a combination of basketball, wrestling, and ballet.
Mhm.
And what I find cool and heartwarming is that this is an active duty Marine regiment,
Yes.
that the Wounded Warriors, you are still a Marine.
And their job is to get well.
Yeah. And these cats that are playing wheelchair basketball are playing wheelchair basketball the way Marines would play it.
It's quite violent.
Describe it.
Well, first of all, there are wheelchairs that are not your usual wheelchair. And the reason I say ballet is that you can spin in these chairs. They are very graceful. I tried one at the Pentagon. They strapped my legs into the chair, and I was trying to learn how to shoot and to dribble, etc. And it's complicated. We had one Marine who was a phenomenal basketball player before he lost both legs and part of one arm. And he still was the star of the team. I saw him at center court. Someone tossed the basketball in his direction. He reached up in the air. He palmed that ball, changed the trajectory, and he got a 3-point shot from center court. How can you not love that?
Years ago, I went to see Cirque du Soleil, right?
Mhm.
And I'm watching these acrobats do just amazing things. And part of me was amazed, but part of me was looking at it going, that's my animal up there. That's me. Those are humans. And look at what we can do. Look at what we can do. And when I hear stories like this, I think, look at how sublime and good and powerful we can be. We're capable of doing the great harm and the failures politically, obviously, that war ends up being the result of. I mean, warfare and government sanctioned violence is always the failure of diplomacy.
Yes.
But case by case, human by human, we can be so marvelous. And nobody in any story you've ever written shines more than Father Smith. No soldier, no Marine or sailor or airman has outstripped that story of that man's commitment to his son. Now, the other side of the coin is the trauma tourists. I have to ask you, walk us through that.
Well, I would especially see folks like that at Walter Reed who, I might be visiting with a Marine and in they'd walk and demand, that they have a photo made with someone who's visibly injured. And that this is going on their company's website or such to show their support for wounded Marines. I even would get phone calls while I was at Quantico where someone would say, hey, we would like to offer this opportunity for a wounded Marine. Can you find someone who's missing a leg? Please get off my phone. Because if that's what you're looking for, you're not looking for our Marines. We care for our Marines and you want to use them. So no.
Yeah.
There's always a mixture. And sometimes, someone shows up and they think they're going to be a trauma tourist. And then, they get to see what's really going on and their heart changes a little. So there's always that. I mean, people are complicated. Yeah.
Look, if by the grace of a benign deity, some family hears this podcast and has the chance to hear from you, so experienced and so deeply faithful in God, but you're also so very faithful in mankind. I know that you believe in us as much as you believe in God, and you have more reason to fall out of faith with us, I think. But if there's somebody out there who's facing this and could use some advice how to steel themselves and their family for this experience, could you distill something for them, something to say, look, this is what you need to get through this?
I suppose the way I look at it is God is always in the business of bringing life out of death. And even if some part of your life dies, like you lose a limb, you have a traumatic brain injury, there is always some way to find life in that. And we always knew we succeeded with our Marines, especially those who were part of the athletic reconditioning program, when they would think of themselves as an athlete. I'm a swimmer, I'm a runner, even though they had two prosthetic legs on the track. When they thought of themselves as something other than a patient, other than someone who had lost part of themselves, they really would thrive. And making that transition from patient to, hey, I still have a life and I'm still here, and God's call in my life may have changed, but it hasn't gone away, and I'm still a person of value and worth. And so anyone who is experiencing that with a family member, if you can help them, remember they still are here and there are still things they are able to do. They're still a person of worth. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of life.
The spark is not extinguished.
It's not. And, oftentimes someone who has had traumatic injuries will refer to the day they didn't die as their alive day. I was taken aback twice while visiting in Walter Reed. Twice I walked in to talk to Marines, and they said, I know it's a leg that I lost, but it's only a leg. And I'm actually thankful because my life was going nowhere. I was hanging out and drinking and doing nothing. And now, I'm refocused, and I plan as soon as I get out of rehab to start college, and I have a direction I want to go with my life. And I'd like to have my leg, but it isn't everything.
Laura, it's always so uplifting to talk to you, even when your stories are like this one, sobering. You have always been an agent of what you said a while ago about your take on God as bringing life out of death. And you have never, for me, and the people that have been around you in the Mighty Pen, ever failed to see that hopeful side of you, because you're also a steely-eyed realist. This story, To Serve and Protect, doesn't sugarcoat anything. You don't make the focus gauzy at all. We take a look at the warriors that have been hurt, and you describe their hurt. And then you describe the possibility of life blooming out of that in real terms. And I appreciate the courage and consistent faith that you write with and that you live with. I'm very, very proud to be your pal.
Thank you.
There, I said it. And with that, I'm going to thank you for yet another very insightful story that we just wouldn't be getting without your efforts. So thank you, chaps.
Well, blessings to you. I'm glad we're friends too.
We'll drop the mic on that. Bye.
Bye.
The Mighty Pen Project is a free writing program for military veterans and their families, offered by the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mpodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best write and tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's piece and many more, use the link to go to the Mighty Pen archive. And if you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Music for this episode was provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen Podcast. It's an honor.